On a hilltop in southern Turkey stands a temple that is 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid. It was built by people who had no cities, no farms, no pottery, no metal tools, and no wheel. People who, according to everything we thought we knew, could not possibly have built it. And then, for reasons nobody understands, they buried the entire thing on purpose. In 1963, surveyors walked this hill, noted some broken limestone slabs, and dismissed it as a medieval cemetery. For 30 years, nobody looked twice. Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt reread that old report, climbed the mound, and understood within minutes that he was standing on something that would rewrite human history. Under the soil lay rings of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, the tallest over 5 meters high and weighing up to 10 tons. Their surfaces crawl with carved foxes, scorpions, snakes, and vultures. Some pillars have arms, hands, and belts. They are stylized people, giants of stone, standing in circles, staring inward at something we can no longer see. Then came the radiocarbon dates, and archaeology quietly had a crisis. The oldest enclosures were built around 9500 BC, that is 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids. When these pillars were raised, the last ice age had barely ended, and the entire human species still lived by hunting and gathering. And that is the problem. Hunter-gatherers were not supposed to do this. Quarrying, carving, and raising 10-ton pillars takes hundreds of coordinated workers, and every one of them has to be fed. There were no farms, no granaries, no kings to give orders. Yet somehow, scattered bands of foragers organized one of the most ambitious construction projects of their age. So Schmidt proposed something radical. We had the story of civilization backwards. We assumed people settled down, invented farming, and only then built temples. Göbekli Tepe suggests the temple came first, that the need to gather and worship pulled scattered bands together. And some of the world's earliest domesticated wheat grew on a mountain within sight of the hill. The carvings guard their secrets. One pillar, the so-called vulture stone, shows a bird cradling a sphere above a headless human body. Some researchers read it as a death ritual, others as a memory of a catastrophe in the sky. Nearby stood the Urfa man, the oldest life-size statue of a human being ever found, staring from 11,000 years ago with obsidian eyes. Then comes the strangest fact of all. Around 8,000 BC, after more than 1,000 years of use, the builders' descendants filled the enclosures with rubble and earth, deliberately, carefully, completely. They didn't abandon the temple, they buried it. Nobody knows why, but that burial sealed and preserved it so perfectly that it waited, intact, for 10,000 years. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Barely 5% of the site has been excavated, and the surrounding hills hide at least a dozen sister sites. Karahan Tepe, with its chamber of carved stone heads, may be even older. Turkish archaeologists now call the region the Stone Hills. An entire unknown chapter of human history is still underground. Every schoolbook said civilization began with farming 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. A single hill in Turkey pushed that story back into the Ice Age and turned it upside down, which raises the only question that matters. If we were that wrong about our own beginning, what else are we wrong about? Subscribe for more forgotten history. And tell me below, why do you think they buried it? 4,500 years ago, while Egypt was raising its pyramids, another civilization was quietly becoming the largest on Earth, and it may be the one you know least about. It stretched across nearly 1 million square kilometers of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, built cities of baked brick with running water and dead straight streets, and traded with empires 1,000 miles away. Then, within a few centuries, it dissolved, its cities emptied, its name forgotten, its writing unread to this day. This is the Indus Valley civilization, the ancient world's great vanishing act. For most of history, no one even knew it had existed. In the 1850s, British engineers building a railway across the Punjab dug up ancient bricks from a mound called Harappa and ground them into gravel for the track bed, pulverizing a lost city without realizing it. Only in the 1920s did archaeologists grasp the truth. Those bricks were 5,000 years old, and Harappa was one of a pair of vast twin capitals. 100 miles south lay the other, an even greater city that would become the icon of the whole culture, Mohenjo-Daro, the Mound of the Dead. What they uncovered rewrote the map of the ancient world. This was not a city or a kingdom, but a civilization on the scale of a continent, more than 1,000 settlements spread across an area larger than Western Europe, home to perhaps 5 million people at its height. It stood as one of the three great Bronze Age civilizations, alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia. But where those two left us pharaohs and kings, temples and epics, the Indus left something far stranger, a world of astonishing order and almost total silence about who ran it. Because the cities themselves are the real marvel. They were planned, laid out on a grid, oriented to the compass, divided into neat blocks, thousands of years before anyone else thought to try. Houses had private wells, bathing platforms, and toilets connected to covered street drains, a municipal sewage system the modern world would not match until the 19th century. Bricks and weights were standardized across hundreds of miles in perfect mathematical ratios. And at the heart of Mohenjo-Daro sat the Great Bath, a watertight brick pool that may be the oldest such structure anywhere on the planet. And here is the deepest puzzle. In a civilization this large and this rich, archaeologists have found no palaces, no royal tombs, no colossal statues of god-kings, and almost no weapons of war. There is no obvious sign of an army, a monarchy, or a priestly elite lording over everyone else. The two most famous objects it left behind are human-scale and quietly astonishing, a small carved bust nicknamed the Priest King, and a tiny bronze figure of a girl, hand on hip, mid-stride, utterly alive after 4,500 years. Who governed this world, nobody knows. They did leave writing everywhere. Thousands of small carved seals survive, most showing an animal, often a magnificent humped bull or a mysterious unicorn-like beast, above a short line of symbols. There are more than 400 distinct signs. It looks like a script, it behaves like a script. But every inscription is tiny, usually just 5 signs, never more than a couple of dozen, and there is no bilingual key, no Rosetta Stone to crack it. Despite a century of effort and modern computers, the Indus script has never been read. We can watch them speaking, and we cannot hear a single word. What we can trace is how far their reach extended. Indus merchants carried their goods across the ancient world, beautiful long carnelian beads, etched by a secret technique, turn up in the royal Grave of Ur in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian records speak of ships from a distant land they called Meluha, almost certainly the Indus, bringing timber, ivory, gold, and exotic animals. For a time, this silent civilization was one of the great commercial powers on Earth, plugged into a Bronze Age trading world that stretched from the Indian plains to the Persian Gulf. And then, from around 1900 BC, it came apart. The great cities were gradually abandoned, their people drifting east and south into smaller farming villages. The hallmarks of the civilization, the standard weights, the writing, the long-distance trade, the meticulous city planning faded and vanished one by one. There was no dramatic conquest, no single catastrophe frozen in the ruins. People simply stopped maintaining the extraordinary system that had bound them together, until the great grid cities stood silent and empty, slowly melting back into the plain. So what undid them? For a long time, scholars blamed invaders, waves of horsemen sweeping down from the north, but the evidence for any violent conquest never materialized, and that theory has largely collapsed. The likelier culprit is the climate. A centuries-long weakening of the monsoon brought drought and failing harvests, while a great river system that once watered the eastern half of the civilization, perhaps the Sarasvati of later legend, shifted its course and ran dry. Deprive a civilization of its rivers and its rain, and even the best-planned cities in the world cannot hold. Today, the Indus Valley remains the great enigma of the ancient world, the largest, the most advanced, and the most peaceful of the Bronze Age civilizations, and by far the least understood. We can walk its streets, admire its plumbing, hold its jewelry, and stare at its writing, and still we cannot name a single one of its kings, its gods, or even its cities, because we cannot read the words it left behind. 5 million people built a world without palaces or armies and then let it slip quietly into the dust. Subscribe. The vault keeps the civilizations that learn to vanish.
Around 1200 BC, the entire civilized world collapsed at once. Not one empire, all of them. Within a single generation, nearly every great city between Greece and Mesopotamia was burned, abandoned, or reduced to a village. Writing disappeared. Trade stopped. And 3,000 years later, historians still cannot fully explain what happened. This is the Bronze Age collapse. To understand what was lost, you need to see what existed. The Late Bronze Age was a globalized world. Egyptian pharaohs wrote letters to Hittite kings. Copper from Cyprus met tin from Afghanistan to make bronze. A single shipwreck from the era, found off Uluburun in Turkey, carried cargo from at least 7 different civilizations. These kingdoms depended on each other completely. Then, within a few decades, the lights went out everywhere. Hattusa, capital of the mighty Hittite Empire, was burned and never rebuilt. An empire that had rivaled Egypt simply ceased to exist. Ugarit, the wealthiest trading port on the Mediterranean coast, was destroyed so suddenly that unsent letters begging for military help were found still sitting in its ovens. In Greece, the palaces of Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns went up in flames. And here is the detail that should stop you cold: the Greeks forgot how to write. Their script, Linear B, vanished with the palace scribes who used it. For the next 400 years, Greece produced not a single written word. Civilization did not just decline. It rebooted. Egyptian records blame mysterious invaders they called the Sea Peoples, a coalition of raiders who appeared from nowhere, destroyed everything in their path, and were finally stopped at the very edge of Egypt. Pharaoh Ramesses III carved the battle into his temple walls. But no one has ever conclusively identified who the Sea Peoples were, or where they came from. Modern science tells a more unsettling story. Climate data shows a massive, decades-long drought striking the region at exactly this time. Add earthquakes, famine, and disrupted trade, and you get what historians call a systems collapse. Each kingdom leaned on the others, so when one fell, the shock spread through the whole network. The Sea Peoples may not have caused the collapse. They may have been its refugees. What followed is called a Dark Age, and the name fits. Populations crashed. Skills vanished: monumental building, fine art, sea navigation, bureaucracy. In some regions, archaeologists find nothing for centuries but crude pottery and small farming villages sitting on the ruins of palaces their builders could no longer even imagine constructing. Yet out of that darkness came something extraordinary. The survivors told stories about the lost world, of great kings, bronze-clad heroes, and a war at Troy. Centuries later, those stories became Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the foundation of Western literature. The Greeks even learned to write again, borrowing an alphabet from Phoenician traders. The seeds of the classical world were planted in the ashes of the old one. The civilization that eventually rose from that dark age gave us philosophy, democracy, and science. But the lesson of 1177 BC remains: the most advanced, most connected societies are also the most fragile, because everything depends on everything else. Sound familiar? If this story made you think, subscribe for more forgotten history, and tell me in the comments which collapse theory you find most convincing.
Around 1200 BC, the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean were burning, one after another, in a collapse so total that it took the ancient world 3 centuries to recover. And carved onto the walls of an Egyptian temple is the face of the accused, a coalition of mysterious seaborne raiders the Egyptians called simply the peoples of the sea. Where they came from, nobody knows. Where they went, nobody knows. But they arrived at the end of the world and helped bring it. To feel the shock, you have to see the world they shattered. For centuries, the Late Bronze Age had been an age of superpowers. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, the great trading cities of the Levant, all bound together in a web of diplomacy, trade, and royal marriages. Kings wrote letters to one another as brother. Bronze, tin, and gold flowed across the sea. It was the most interconnected the world had ever been, and in the span of a single generation, almost all of it collapsed. The evidence is written in ash. City after city across the region shows the same thing, a layer of burning and destruction, and then silence. The rich trading port of Ogarit on the Syrian coast was wiped out so suddenly that a final desperate letter survives, baked hard in the fire that destroyed the city. "The enemy ships are already here," it says. "They have set fire to my towns and done evil things." The letter was never sent. Ogarit never rose again. Only Egypt kept good records, and only because Egypt barely survived. The pharaoh Ramesses III recorded 2 great invasions by the sea peoples, land and sea, and carved the whole account across his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. His inscriptions describe a confederation on the move. No land could stand before their arms. They had already swept away the Hittites, he says, and Cyprus, and the cities of the Levant, and now they were coming for Egypt itself, bringing their families in ox carts as if to settle for good. The temple walls show the enemy in vivid detail, warriors in strange feathered headdresses and horned helmets fighting from ships with bird-headed prows. Ramesses claims a great victory, trapping their fleet in the mouths of the Nile and destroying it in a hail of arrows. It is the first recorded sea battle in history. Egypt held, but it was a wound, not a triumph. Within a few generations, the new kingdom's power drained away, and Egypt too slid into decline. Across the sea, the Mycenaean Greek world, the world of the heroes later sung by Homer, was collapsing at the same time. Its mighty citadels were burned or abandoned, its palace bureaucracies erased, its very writing forgotten. Greece plunged into a dark age so deep that when the Greeks re-emerged centuries later, they had lost the art of writing entirely and remembered their own ancestors only as myth. The Trojan War, whatever its truth, is an echo of this vanished age. So who were the sea peoples, and why did the world fall? Here the mystery deepens. The Egyptian names for them, Peliset, Shekelesh, Shurden, and more, have been linked to places all across the Mediterranean, from the Aegean to Italy to the coast of Anatolia, but nothing is certain. And modern scholars increasingly suspect the raiders were not the cause of the collapse so much as a symptom, refugees and opportunists set in motion by something larger. Because the sea peoples arrived amid a perfect storm of catastrophes, climate records show a long, brutal drought gripped the eastern Mediterranean at exactly this time, bringing famine. A cluster of powerful earthquakes, an earthquake storm, struck the region within decades. Trade routes carrying the vital tin for bronze broke down. Some scholars add internal rebellion and the spread of cheaper iron weapons. The sea peoples may have been ordinary people fleeing a collapsing world and speeding its fall as they came. And here is the twist that survives in a name you may know. One group among the raiders, the Peliset, settled on the coast of the southern Levant after the wars and became the people the Hebrew Bible calls the Philistines. Goliath's people, the great rivals of ancient Israel, may have been descendants of the very sea peoples who helped topple the Bronze Age. The raiders who ended one world quietly seeded another, their name echoing down through scripture and eventually into the word Palestine. So the sea peoples remain history's great scapegoats and history's great enigma, a name for a disaster we still don't fully understand. They may have been a fleet, a migration, a symptom, or all three at once. What is certain is that the world they crossed was gone within a lifetime. The palaces burned, the scripts forgotten, the brotherhood of kings dissolved into 3 dark centuries. They sailed out of nowhere, into a dying age, and back into the unknown. Subscribe, and if you haven't seen how that world fell, the story of the Bronze Age collapse is waiting in the vault. In 1963, a man in central Turkey knocked down a wall in his basement during renovations. Behind it was a tunnel. The tunnel led to a room, the room to a stairway, and the stairway down into the dark, 18 stories down. He had broken into a complete underground city, large enough to shelter 20,000 people that had been sealed and forgotten beneath his village. This is Derinkuyu. The region already whispered its secret. Cappadocia's soft volcanic rock is honeycombed with cave homes, and locals told stories of chickens that slipped into cracks in cellar floors and never came back. But nobody imagined what the anonymous homeowner found: passages descending 85 meters below the surface, a vertical labyrinth deeper than a 20-story building is tall. As archaeologists mapped it, the scale kept expanding. Living quarters and kitchens, stables for livestock underground, wine presses, oil presses, storage halls, a school with a vaulted ceiling, chapels, even a burial chamber. More than 50 ventilation shafts fed fresh air to the deepest levels, and interior wells meant the city could drink without ever touching the surface. The architecture is openly military. At choke points throughout the complex sit massive circular stone doors, half-done discs, rolled across the passage from the inside, with a small hole in the center for spears or arrows. The corridors were deliberately cut low and narrow, forcing invaders to stoop, single file, into the dark, toward defenders who knew every turn. The oldest levels may date to the Phrygians, nearly 3,000 years ago. The Hittites are sometimes credited with the first cellars earlier still. But it was Byzantine Christians, from roughly the 7th century onward, who expanded it into a true city, carving crosses and chapels into the deep rock while empires collided overhead. Because that is what Derinkuyu was for, surviving the surface. Cappadocia sat on the raiding frontier between Byzantium and the Arab caliphates for centuries. When war bands swept through, entire communities descended with their animals, rolled the stones shut, and lived by lamplight, venting their cooking smoke through shafts that scattered it far from the hidden entrances. The city wasn't a refuge of last resort, it was a routine. And Derinkuyu is not alone. A tunnel, kilometers long, is believed to link it toward Göbekli, the next underground city, wide enough for 3 people abreast. Across Cappadocia, researchers count more than 200 underground settlements of at least 2 stories, perhaps 40 of 3 or more. An entire parallel civilization built downward. Life inside stretches the imagination. Thousands of people in permanent night, weeks at a time, children in the schoolroom, animals shifting in the stone stables, the smell of oil lamps and bread, prayers echoing in a chapel 5 floors beneath the fields. It worked because the temperature never moves, a constant 13 degrees, summer sieges or winter storms alike. Here is the strangest part. The city never entirely left living memory. Cappadocian Greek communities still used the tunnels as refuges into the 20th century, until the population exchange of 1923 removed them to Greece. The entrances were sealed, the knowledge left with the exiles, and within 1 generation Derinkuyu was so forgotten that a man had to find it with a sledgehammer. Today you can descend 8 levels as a tourist, the rest stays closed, and much may still be unexcavated. In 2013, demolition work in nearby Nevşehir exposed yet another underground city, possibly larger still, which leaves a fine question for the age of satellites. How many complete cities are still down there, behind some wall, waiting for a renovation? Subscribe for more of the world hidden underfoot. For more than 2,000 years, people have searched the oceans of the world for a sunken civilization, a golden island empire that supposedly vanished beneath the waves in a single day and night. Expeditions have hunted it in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, even Antarctica. Whole libraries have been written about it. And here is the strange truth at the heart of all that obsession. Every last word we have about Atlantis comes from a single author, writing a work of philosophy, who almost certainly made the whole thing up. This is the story of the most famous place that never existed. The one and only source is the Greek philosopher Plato, writing around 360 BC. In 2 of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, he describes a mighty island power that had existed 9,000 years earlier, a naval empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, richer and stronger than any nation on earth. No writer before Plato ever mentions Atlantis, not one. It appears fully formed in the work of a philosopher famous for teaching through invented stories. And then, when Plato dies, the tale simply stops until the modern world digs it back up. Plato's story is vivid and specific. Atlantis, he says, lay just beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, a landmass larger than Libya and Asia combined. Its kings ruled a great confederation and grew arrogant with power, launching a war to enslave the Mediterranean world. Only ancient Athens stood against them. And then, in Plato's words, came violent earthquakes and floods. In a single terrible day and night, the whole island sank into the sea and disappeared, leaving only impassable mud where an empire had been. So why do scholars think he invented it? Because of what Plato was doing with the story. Atlantis is the villain of a moral fable, a proud, decadent superpower crushed by the gods, held up as a warning against arrogance and set against a noble, idealized Athens. It fits Plato's philosophy perfectly and appears nowhere outside it. His own most brilliant student, Aristotle, is reported to have dismissed it flatly. The man who invented Atlantis, he supposedly said, was also the man who sank it. To the ancient Greeks, it was a parable, not a place. But Plato was too good a writer. He wrapped his fable in the texture of real history, precise measurements, concentric rings of land and water, canals, harbors, hot and cold springs, walls sheathed in gleaming metal. He even claimed the story came down through the Egyptian priests to the Athenian lawgiver Solon, giving it a chain of respectable witnesses. That realism is exactly why the tale refuses to die. It reads less like a myth than like a documentary of a lost world. And for 2,000 years, readers have found it far easier to go looking for Atlantis than to accept that a philosopher simply made it up. Modern obsession truly ignited in 1882, when an American writer named Ignatius Donnelly published a bestseller arguing that Atlantis had been real, the mother of all civilizations, the source of every ancient culture from Egypt to the Americas. It was pseudoscience, but it was irresistible. From there the idea spiraled. Occultists made Atlantis a spiritual homeland, fringe theorists tied it to everything from aliens to Antarctica, and it colonized novels, films, and cartoons. A throwaway parable by a Greek philosopher had become the most persistent lost world myth in human history. And yet the legend may hide a grain of something real, because the sea genuinely has swallowed advanced civilizations. Around 1600 BC, the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, erupted in one of the most violent blasts of the ancient world, blowing out its own center and collapsing into a vast flooded crater. It devastated the sophisticated seafaring culture of the region and sent tsunamis across the Mediterranean. A wealthy island power, destroyed by fire and sea in a matter of days, the echoes with Plato's tale are hard to ignore. The victims were the Minoans, Europe's first great civilization, centered on nearby Crete, with sprawling palaces, plumbing, fleets, and dazzling art. On Thera itself, the town of Akrotiri was buried under meters of ash, preserving beautiful frescoes of ships and dancers, a Bronze Age Pompeii frozen midlife. Within a few generations of the eruption, the Minoan world declined and fell. Many scholars believe this real catastrophe, a brilliant island civilization drowned and half forgotten, is the distant memory that Plato reshaped, centuries later, into the fable of Atlantis. Nor is Thera alone. Off the coast of Egypt lie the drowned ruins of Thonis Heracleion, a whole port city swallowed by the sea and rediscovered only in 2000. Beneath the waves near Greece rests Pavloptri, one of the oldest submerged towns on Earth. And under the North Sea sleeps Doggerland, a vast inhabited landscape drowned by rising waters after the last ice age. The sea really does take civilizations. Atlantis is a myth, but the fear it speaks to, of a whole world lost beneath the water, is founded in absolute truth. Perhaps that is why Atlantis will never sink for good. It survives not because anyone has found it, but because we cannot quite let it go, a mirror in which every age sees its own hopes and dreads. To some it is a lost utopia, to others a warning about pride and collapse, to others still a puzzle demanding an answer that will never come, because there was never an island to find. One philosopher, one story, one imagined day when the ocean closed over a golden empire. Subscribe, the vault keeps the worlds we only imagined losing. On the loneliest inhabited island on Earth stand nearly 1,000 stone giants, some taller than a 3-story building, carved without metal, moved without wheels, raised without cranes. The people who made them built one of the most extraordinary cultures in the Pacific. And then their world collapsed so completely that when Europeans arrived, the statues were already falling, and nobody could agree on why. Rapa Nui sits 3,500 kilometers off the coast of Chile. Its nearest inhabited neighbor is 2,000 kilometers away. Polynesian navigators found this speck of land around the 12th century, arguably the most audacious feat of exploration in human history, reading stars, swells, and seabirds from open canoes. They landed on an island covered in palm forest. That detail matters. Nearly all the statues were born in one place, the volcanic quarry of Ranu Raraku, where hundreds still lie today, half-carved in the rock face, abandoned mid-journey, buried to their shoulders in silt. The largest ever attempted, El Gigante, would have stood 21 meters and weighed perhaps 200 tons. The quarry looks less like an archaeological site than a factory stopped mid-shift. And the famous heads are a misunderstanding. They have bodies. Decades of erosion buried the torsos, leaving only heads above the slope. Excavated, the figures descend 6, 8, 10 meters, their backs carved with symbols. Each was a deified ancestor, erected on coastal platforms with its back to the sea, watching over its descendants, not the ocean. You move an 80-ton statue kilometers across an island with no draft animals, no wheels, no metal. Islanders always gave the same answer: the Moai walked. For decades, scholars smiled politely. Then researchers strapped ropes to a replica, 3 teams rocking it side to side, and it walked, upright, waddling forward like a refrigerator, exactly as the oral tradition said. The engineering was in the statue's belly forward, lean all along. Then the forest died. When the first canoes landed, tens of millions of giant palms covered the island. By the 18th century, virtually every tree was gone. The old story blames reckless islanders felling everything to move statues. The newer evidence adds a quieter culprit. The Polynesian rat arrived with the canoes, eating palm nuts faster than the slow-growing trees could reproduce. Axes above, teeth below, the forest never stood a chance. What followed is one of history's great arguments. The old textbook version, ecocide, a society that destroyed itself in statue-building mania, has been challenged by archaeology showing the islanders adapting brilliantly. Rock gardens that trapped moisture, new fishing strategies, a population that likely stayed stable long after the last tree fell. The Moai builders didn't vanish when the forest did. They adjusted and kept carving. The statue era still ended. Sometime after European contact, the Moai began to fall, toppled in conflicts, or deliberately laid down as the old ancestor religion gave way to the strange new birdman cult of Orongo, where champions raced down cliffs and swam to a seabird islet to win their clan a year of authority. One of the finest Moai, Hoa Hakananya, was carried off by a British crew in 1868. It stands in London today, its back carved with birdman symbols, a single stone recording both religions. The true catastrophe arrived by sea. In 1862, Peruvian slave raiders abducted perhaps 1,500 islanders, half the population, including most who held the old knowledge. The few who returned brought smallpox. By 1877, 111 people remained on Rapa Nui. Rongorongo, the island's mysterious script, possibly one of the few writing systems ever independently invented, became unreadable because everyone who could read it was dead or enslaved. Today the statues stand again on their platforms, re-raised by archaeologists and islanders, and Rapa Nui's people, who never disappeared, are still there to receive the tourists. The island remains what it has always been, a mirror. Ecocide parable, colonial tragedy, engineering triumph, every generation reads its own fears into those stone faces. The statues just keep watching. Subscribe for more of history's silent witnesses, and tell me, what do you see in them? Deep in the Cambodian jungle stands the largest religious monument ever built, a temple the size of a small town, ringed by a moat you could sail a fleet on, its 5 towers shaped like lotus buds reaching for the sky. Angkor Wat is so vast it can be seen from space, and it was only the centerpiece. Around it, hidden under centuries of forest, lie the bones of something even more staggering, a medieval megacity that may have housed close to 1 million people at a time when London held perhaps 20,000. This is Angkor, and for 400 years, the world almost forgot it existed. Angkor was the capital of the Khmer Empire, which for over half a millennium dominated Southeast Asia, its power stretching across modern Cambodia and deep into Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. Its kings styled themselves god kings, earthly counterparts of the divine, and each sought to outbuild the last. The result, by the 12th century, was the largest city on the planet, not a walled dot on a map, but a vast, low-density sprawl of temples, houses, markets, and rice fields covering an area the size of a modern capital. Angkor Wat itself rose in the early 1100s under King Suryavarman II, by some estimates involving hundreds of thousands of workers and thousands of elephants, hauling millions of sandstone blocks from quarries 40 kilometers away. Every surface tells stories, nearly 2,000 carved celestial dancers and half a kilometer of bas-reliefs depicting wars, processions, heaven and hell, and the great Hindu creation myth, gods and demons churning an ocean of milk to win the elixir of immortality. It was built as a Hindu temple to Vishnu. Within a century or two, it had become Buddhist, and it has never stood empty. But Angkor's real miracle was invisible from the temples: water. The Khmer engineered one of the most sophisticated hydraulic systems of the pre-modern world, colossal reservoirs called barrays, the largest 8 kilometers long, feeding a web of canals, dikes, and channels that tamed the violent swing between monsoon flood and dry season drought. This water grid turned the land into a rice machine capable of feeding 1 million mouths and made the city's very existence possible. Angkor did not just live beside water, it was built out of it. Around 1200, under the great builder King Jayavarman VII, Angkor reached its peak. At the heart of his walled city of Angkor Thom rose the Bayon, a temple mountain crowned with dozens of towers, each carved with 4 colossal serene faces gazing to the compass points, perhaps the king, perhaps a bodhisattva, perhaps both. He built hospitals, rest houses, and roads across the empire. Stand beneath those faces today, and you are looking at the high-water mark of a civilization, carved in stone just before the tide turned. Then, over the 14th and 15th centuries, the tide went out. The empire fought exhausting wars, the state religion shifted, trade moved toward the coast, and in 1431 armies from Ayutthaya in modern Thailand sacked the city. The royal court packed up and moved south toward what is now Phnom Penh. The great water machine, starved of maintenance, silted and broke. And hectare by hectare, the forest crept back in strangler figs and silk cotton trees, prying apart the very temples, their roots pouring over walls like slow-motion floods. For centuries, Angkor's fall was a romantic mystery. Now science has read the verdict in the trees. Centuries-old cypresses record what the chronicles don't. In Angkor's final century, Southeast Asia was hammered by decades-long megadroughts, broken by monsoon years so violent they tore the canals apart. The world's greatest water city was hit by the one enemy it couldn't engineer away, a climate swinging between extremes. The system that fed 1 million people became a trap, too big to maintain, too rigid to adapt. Sound familiar? Angkor was never truly lost. Buddhist monks kept Angkor Wat alive as a shrine, and Khmer people always knew the ruins were there. But to the wider world, it had become a rumor, half legend, half traveler's tale. Then in 1860, a French naturalist named Henry Mauhot walked into the ruins, filled his journals with awe, grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome, he wrote, and died of fever soon after. His published diaries lit a fire in the European imagination, and the lost city in the jungle became the most famous ruin on Earth. The deepest revelation came in our own century. In the 2010s, archaeologists flew lasers over the forest, LiDAR, and stripped the jungle away digitally. What emerged stunned even the experts. Entire street grids, house mounds, canals, and unknown cities sprawling far beyond the temples, confirming Angkor as one of the largest urban landscapes of the pre-industrial world. The temples, it turns out, were never the city. They were merely the stone heart of a wooden metropolis that rotted away, leaving its ghost printed on the ground. Today, Angkor Wat is the soul of a nation. It flies on Cambodia's flag, the only building on any national flag on Earth, and millions walk its causeways every year. Monks in saffron robes still pray where god kings once did. Restorers still pull the forest, root by root, from the galleries. The empire is gone, its wooden city dissolved, its million people dust. But the stone heart they built has outlived them all, patient under the strangler figs. Subscribe, the vault keeps the cities the jungle tried to keep for itself. "30 miles from Mexico City stand the ruins of a metropolis that once held more people than Rome at its height, laid out on a master plan, crowned by one of the largest pyramids on Earth, and threaded by a ceremonial boulevard the Aztecs would later name the Avenue of the Dead. It was the greatest city the Americas had ever seen. And here is the astonishing part: we do not know who built it. We do not know what language they spoke, what they called themselves, or even what they called their city. The name we use, Teotihuacan, was given centuries later by awestruck strangers. When the Aztecs found the site in the 1300s, it had already been a ruin for 600 years. They walked its silent avenue, stared up at pyramids the size of hills, and concluded that no ordinary humans could have raised them. They named the place Teotihuacan, roughly, the place where the gods were born, and made it their own pilgrimage site. Aztec emperors held ceremonies among the ruins. Even the mighty, it turns out, can inherit someone else's mystery. Everything the Aztecs told the Spanish about the city was already legend, not memory. The scale still stuns visitors today. The Pyramid of the Sun rises over 60 meters, with a footprint rivaling the Great Pyramid of Giza, more than 1 million cubic meters of stone and earth, hauled without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools. Beneath it, archaeologists found a man-made tunnel and chambers, perhaps a symbolic underworld. At the avenue's northern end stands the Pyramid of the Moon, mirroring the mountain behind it so precisely that architecture and landscape blur into a single design. This was not a city that grew. It was a city that was asterisk composed. At its peak, around 400 AD, Teotihuacan may have housed 125,000 people or more, one of the half-dozen largest cities on the planet at the time. And it was strange by every ancient standard. Most of its people lived not in huts, but in over 2,000 spacious, single-story apartment compounds with plastered walls, painted murals, and drainage, housing quality some scholars call unmatched in the premodern world. Its neighborhoods held migrants from across Mesoamerica, Zapotec, Maya, Gulf Coast communities, each with their own quarter. It was, in the truest sense, the first great cosmopolitan city of the Americas. There is a darker layer. Beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, its facade studded with snarling stone serpent heads, archaeologists uncovered the remains of more than 200 people, many with their hands bound behind their backs, soldiers and captives, sacrificed by the hundreds when the temple was dedicated around 200 AD. Whoever ruled this city could command death on an industrial scale. And yet the rulers themselves are ghosts. No royal tombs, no boastful king portraits, no named dynasties, a total inversion of the Maya world next door, where kings carved their names into everything. That silence is Teotihuacan's deepest riddle. The city left behind thousands of dazzling murals, jaguars, priests, rain gods, a mysterious great goddess wreathed in butterflies and spiders, but no readable script recording rulers or history. Some researchers think the city was run not by god kings, but by something closer to a council of elite houses, a corporate government 1,000 years ahead of its time. Others see a theocracy so absolute the ruler needed no portrait. The truth is simply this: a superpower ran half of Mesoamerica, and we cannot name a single one of its leaders. Because a superpower it was. In 378 AD, Maya inscriptions 400 miles away record a chilling event. Strangers from the west arrived at the great city of Tikal. Its king died that same day, and a new dynasty with Teotihuacan connections took the throne. The carved portraits that follow show warriors in Teotihuacan dress, carrying Teotihuacan spear throwers. Whether it was conquest, coup, or alliance, the message is the same: the anonymous city could reach across Mesoamerica and rearrange kingdoms. Then around 550 AD, the city itself was put to the flame, and not by outside invaders. The burning was selective. Temples, palaces, and monuments along the Avenue of the Dead were torched and smashed, while ordinary neighborhoods stood untouched. Sculptures were toppled and deliberately shattered. To many archaeologists, it looks like an uprising, the city's own people rising against whatever power sat at its center, possibly after droughts and hunger broke the ruler's credibility. The state collapsed, the population drained away, and the composed city fell silent. Teotihuacan still yields secrets. In 2003, heavy rains opened a sinkhole at the Feathered Serpent Temple, revealing a sealed tunnel untouched for 18 centuries. Inside, excavators found tens of thousands of ritual objects: greenstone statues, rubber balls, jaguar remains, pyrite spheres glittering like stars on the ceiling, and pools of liquid mercury, perhaps a model of the underworld's rivers. Many believe a royal tomb waits at its end. If one is ever found, the nameless city might finally produce a name. Until then, Teotihuacan remains the greatest anonymous achievement in the hemisphere, a city that housed 100,000 people in painted apartments, projected power across a continent, and then erased itself so thoroughly that even its successors could only call it the birthplace of gods. Millions climb its pyramids every year, walking an avenue whose true name nobody has spoken for 1,500 years. Subscribe. The vault keeps the cities that never told us their names. High in the Peruvian Andes, on a knife-edge ridge between two peaks, sits a stone city wrapped in cloud forest, invisible from the valley floor 2,500 feet below. When the Spanish conquistadors tore the Inca Empire apart in the 16th century, they looted and demolished every sacred site they could reach. They never reached this one. They never even learned it existed. And so Machu Picchu waited, hidden in the clouds, for almost 400 years, the only great Inca city to survive the conquest untouched. This is the city that was saved by being forgotten. In July 1911, a Yale historian named Hiram Bingham was trekking up the Urubamba Valley hunting for the lost city of the Incas, the last refuge of the empire's final rebels. A local farmer, Melchor Artiga, mentioned ruins on a ridge called Machu Picchu, Old Mountain. For one soul, he led Bingham up a brutal climb through the jungle. At the top, a boy walked the astonished explorer into terraces and temples swallowed by vines. Bingham had found the wrong city. This was not the rebel capital he sought, but what he had stumbled into was infinitely more precious: an Inca royal city intact. The city's builder, most scholars now agree, was the empire itself in miniature. Pachacuti, the ninth Inca ruler, the Alexander of the Andes. Around 1450, fresh from turning a small kingdom into the largest empire in the Americas, he ordered a royal estate raised on this impossible ridge, part palace, part temple, part retreat for the imperial court. Perhaps 750 people lived there at its height: nobles, priests, astronomers, and the servants who kept the mountain city running. It was, in effect, the emperor's private heaven built where the mountains meet the sky. Look closely at its walls, and you see why Inca engineering still humbles modern builders. The finest structures are dry stone, no mortar at all, with granite blocks cut and fitted so precisely that a knife blade cannot slide between them. The walls lean slightly inward, corners are rounded, doorways are trapezoids, an ancient engineering package that lets the buildings dance through earthquakes that flatten modern towns nearby. And all of it was done without iron tools, without the wheel, without draft animals. Stone shaped by stone, patience, and genius. The mountain itself was tamed with equal brilliance. Hundreds of step terraces turned near vertical slopes into farmland, and more importantly, into a colossal drainage machine. Layers of topsoil, sand, and gravel that swallow the region's 2 meters of annual rain without landsliding. A spring nearly a kilometer away was channeled along the ridge into a cascade of 16 carved stone fountains, the first at the emperor's own door. 5 centuries on, in one of the wettest, steepest places on Earth, the city still is not sliding off its mountain. Its engineers are still winning. And the city watched the heavens. At its highest point stands the Teotihuacan, the hitching post of the sun, a carved stone whose angles track the solstices. The Temple of the Sun's curved wall catches the June solstice sunrise through a single window. The Incas worshipped the sun as the emperor's divine ancestor, and almost everywhere else, Spanish priests smashed these idolatrous stones on sight. Machu Picchu's Teotihuacan survives because no priest ever climbed this far, one of the very few left standing in all the Andes. Here is the strangest part of the story. We have the city, but not its words. The Incas ran an empire of 10 million people without writing as we know it. Their records lived in quippus, intricate systems of knotted, colored cords that officials could read like ledgers. The Spanish burned most quippus as idolatry, and the art of reading them died. A few hundred survive in museums, holding censuses, tributes, perhaps even histories, an entire imperial archive tied in knots that no living person can fully untie. Machu Picchu keeps its own name barely, everything else, the knots keep silent. Why was it abandoned? Barely a century after it rose, Machu Picchu emptied. The likeliest storyline is grimly simple. European diseases, smallpox racing ahead of the conquistadors themselves, cut down the Inca world. Then civil war and conquest shattered the imperial economy that supplied a luxury mountain estate. The court that summered there was dead or scattered. The road crews stopped coming. The cloud forest crept back over the terraces. Locals always knew ruins stood on the old mountain. Farmers even planted crops among them. But to the wider world, the emperor's heaven simply ceased to exist. Bingham returned with National Geographic sponsorship, cleared the vines, and made Machu Picchu world-famous and controversial. He shipped thousands of artifacts to Yale under agreements Peru understood as temporary. It took a century, a lawsuit, and diplomatic pressure before the collections finally came home to Cusco in the 2010s. Bingham himself was long celebrated as the discoverer, though he had discovered nothing locals didn't already know. His own notes record the names of families living among the ruins. The lost city, like most lost cities, was mainly lost to outsiders. Today, Machu Picchu is the icon of an entire continent, a wonder of the world that more than 1 million people a year climb to see, so many that Peru now rations entry to protect the stones. It remains what it always secretly was, the best preserved window into the Inca world, saved not by walls or weapons, but by clouds, distance, and 4 centuries of silence. The empire fell, the emperor's heaven survived him. Subscribe, the vault keeps the cities that hid until the danger passed. In the hills of southern Africa stands a city of stone, granite walls 11 meters high and 5 meters thick, laid without a single drop of mortar, curving across the landscape for hundreds of meters. It was the heart of a medieval trading empire whose gold reached the ports of China. And for almost a century, the men who ruled this land committed themselves to an astonishing official lie, that Africans could not possibly have built it. This is Great Zimbabwe, the city whose greatest battle was fought not in the Middle Ages, but over who would be allowed to claim its memory. The scale still astonishes. Spread over 7 square kilometers, the ruins fall into 3 great zones, a fortified hill complex crowning a granite whaleback, a sprawling valley of enclosures, and the masterpiece, the Great Enclosure, the largest ancient structure south of the Sahara. Its outer wall alone contains close to 1 million dressed granite blocks, fitted so skillfully that the unmortared masonry has stood for some 700 years. At its height, between the 12th and 15th centuries, the city held as many as 18,000 people. Inside the Great Enclosure, a narrow parallel passage curves between towering walls to a structure that has puzzled every visitor since. The conical tower, 10 meters of solid, perfectly coarse stonework, shaped like a giant granary, containing no door, no chamber, no treasure, just mass and meaning. A symbol of royal power, a monument to the harvest that fed the kingdom. The builders left no writing, so the tower keeps its purpose to itself, architecture as pure statement, in the language of stone. The wealth beneath it all was gold. The Zimbabwe plateau was seamed with it, and the city's rulers controlled the flow from 1,000 inland diggings down to the Indian Ocean ports of the Swahili coast, above all the island city of Kilwa, whose merchants shipped African gold and ivory into a trade web stretching to Arabia, India, and beyond. In exchange, luxuries flowed inland. Excavators in the ruins have found Persian pottery, Arab glass, cowrie shells from the ocean, and shards of Ming Dynasty porcelain from China, sitting in the heart of southern Africa. The city's most haunting treasures are its birds, 8 raptor-like figures carved in soapstone, each about 40 centimeters tall, found perched on columns in the ruins. Part eagle, part something human with lips instead of beaks, and toes in place of talons on some, they are believed to represent royal ancestors, messengers between kings and gods. Nothing quite like them exists anywhere else in Africa. Looted, sold, and scattered to collections abroad in the colonial era, they have mostly slowly come home, and one of them now flies on the national flag. Then came the strangers with theories. In 1871, the German geologist Karl Morch reached the ruins, gazed at the walls, and declared that no African hand could have raised them. This, he decided, was Ophir, the gold fields of the Bible, the Queen of Sheba's city, built by Phoenicians or Israelites in imitation of Solomon's temple. He even claimed a whiff of cedar would prove a Lebanese connection. It was fantasy dressed as scholarship, and it was exactly what Europe's empire builders wanted to hear. Ancient white builders, long vanished, whose land was now free for the taking. The lie became policy. Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company seized the region in the 1890s and named it Rhodesia. Rhodes himself sponsored digs intended to prove the ruins' ancient, meaning non-African, origin. His first hired antiquarian, James Theodore Bent, obligingly blamed Arabians and Phoenicians. Worse followed. Journalist-turned-digger Richard Hall stripped away meters of archaeological deposits, the very evidence of African occupation, as, in his words, the filth and decadence of the Kaffir occupation. The city's memory was being erased in real time. Science answered in 1929, and it arrived in the form of a formidable Cambridge archaeologist named Gertrude Catton Thompson. Digging with stratigraphic rigor and an all-female team, she found no Phoenicians, no Sheba, nothing exotic whatsoever. Every layer, every artifact, every wall was the work of the ancestors of the local Shona people, built in the African Middle Ages. Her verdict was total and unbending. The racists never forgave her. The Rhodesian government went on censoring guidebooks and museum displays into the 1970s. Archaeologists were pressured to keep the builder's identity officially uncertain. The truth, uncovered by generations of archaeologists since, is richer than any myth. Great Zimbabwe was the capital of a Shona kingdom that dominated the plateau for 2 centuries, its very name from Dzimba Dza Mabwe, houses of stone. Around 1450, the city faded, likely as gold routes shifted north and 2 centuries of intensive farming and grazing wore out the surrounding land. Its royal lineages moved on to found new states. The walls stayed, tended in memory, visited by rainmakers, never truly forgotten by the people whose ancestors built them. And that is why this ruin means more than most. When the Liberation War ended white minority rule in 1980, the new nation reached back past a century of denial and named itself after the stone city, Zimbabwe. The soapstone bird stands on its flag, the great enclosure appears on its money. Few monuments anywhere have been asked to carry so much, first as a lie about who could build, then as the proof of who did. The walls, as ever, say nothing, they just stand. Subscribe, the vault keeps the cities that outlasted the lies told about them.